Hi, everybody. We'll get started soon in about 8 minutes. But just want to double check right now, make sure that people can hear me. Um, if you can, just respond in the chat box that you can hear me. Great. Thank you very much. All right. Thank you for that. And like I said, we'll get started here in about 7 minutes now. Thank you. Hi, everybody. Hi, welcome to the Statistics Solutions webinar on Chapter 1, which is the introduction. We should have a support person on soon who will provide you links to things like, our website where our webinars are archived. So this webinar, I think you're sent a copy of the webinar in your email, but we also archive these on our website, so you can access it there as well. Okay, and we do have the support person on who will put those links up soon. Also, if you have any kind of non-content related questions, kind of technical oriented questions, the support person can help you there too. As far as questions, content related questions as we go along, you're welcome to type your questions in the chat box or in the question and answer box, so you don't forget them, but I won't be able to get to them until the end. So just to let you know that. All right, so let's get going. So the chapter 1 is the introduction, which is kind of like, think about it as the blueprint for your study, right? It answers the big questions of, what you're going to do, your study on, your topic, why your study is needed or important, the research problem, and how you're going to conduct your study, which is the methods. So it kind of lays that out. There's other chapters in the proposal where you're going to kind of explain some of these things more, like the literature review and especially the methodology in chapter 3. But this is kind of a blueprint. This kind of lays everything out. So before we get kind of started in earnest on the chapter 1, and here, these are the contents, these are the things we're going to be covering. Let's talk a little bit about topic development, just kind of in a real general sense, because that seems to be something that sometimes people struggle with. Like, how do I get a topic? How do I come up with a topic? How do I kind of turn that into something that's researchable, and kind of make it a research problem, or develop it into a research problem. There's certain ways that we can get to topics. Sometimes it kind of, your interest in something develops organically from your coursework. You've been taking courses on something, you've been maybe you've written papers on it, you've done some research on it for classes. So sometimes your interest in something can kind of stem organically from your coursework, which is actually, if that happens, that can be really good, because you're already kind of doing research on it. Maybe you've written a paper on it, so you're already kind of digging into the thing, the topic already. Sometimes you can have a professional interest. You work in a certain sector or a certain area, and that can drive your interest into researching something that related to your professional interest or your job. That's also helpful as well, or a way to get to topics and ideas. Or you could just be curious about something, or have a passion for something, or just something you're really interested in. That's also a good way to get to a topic or ideas. However, all those ways to kind of come to a topic, while they're fine, anything you do needs to be kind of confirmed and supported within the research. And so any of these kind of ways that you get to your topic or your ideas, you then need to kind of start digging into the research. And this is even before the lit review, because you're still going to need research to base your ideas on. You're going to need research to base your research problem on. So even if you're gravitating towards something, okay, then the next step is to go see what's been done on it. Right. You don't need to kind of find everything out at this point, but you need to kind of start digging into it and get a sense of what's been done on the topic, what's been done on whatever idea you have, and what are the possibilities, like the avenues you can take, right? Maybe certain things have already been covered. So, that will kind of steer you in different directions, right? So you need to see what's been done on your topic. Once you kind of get that idea, or you kind of get a direction, so the idea is to kind of have an idea, have a direction, have a topic, but you're going to have be loose within that idea, right? Or within that topic, and you kind of follow the contours of the research, see what's been done. And then once you find out what's been done, kind of get a lay of the research. That way you can see what still needs to be done, right? And what still needs to be done, what researchers have not covered, those are avenues that are ripe for new research and potentially, a direction for you or a research problem for you. Also look when you're kind of doing this initial research, go to the ends of articles where they talk about things like recommendations for future research. These are great places to find suggestions for research that still needs to be done. And the added benefit is that you have somebody saying it. So you have like a source already of somebody saying, hey, we need research in this area. So be sure to check, again, the ends of some of these studies and some of this research you're looking at to get ideas for directions for your study or for your research. So that's a little bit generally about topic development. How to get to your topic, how to kind of refine it once you get there, seeing what's in the research, what's not in the research. And we can talk a little bit more about the research problem when we get to the research problem section as we move forward here. Okay, so these are, again, the sections we'll be covering for the chapter 1. These sections are fairly standard, but you're going to hear me say this several times throughout the presentation. Obtain your school's template for the dissertation. I mean, that's really important because that is your guide. That is what your school wants you to follow. Having said that, again, this should act as a good, solid general template, because a lot of these sections, a lot of the expectations are similar. They run across schools, but sometimes schools have specifics that are particular to their school. So it's always best to have your school's template. Okay. All right, so the introduction to the chapter 1, which is the introduction to the introduction. Basically, you just want to set out what your topic, what your topic's going to be, and these are broad strokes, right? Because it's the introduction. You're going to flesh all this out as you go along. What is your topic and what is it based on? So every topic is based on some kind of a problem, right? Some kind of there's an issue. Otherwise, we don't research something just because we're really interested. And this goes back to topic development. You can be interested in something, that's fine, or have a passion for something. But then within the research, once you start researching, your interest or your passion needs to be supported by the need for that in the research. So usually things stem from, there's some kind of organizational problem, there's some kind of social problem. It can be, if it's education, it can be declining test scores in something. It can be, students leaving college, dropout. It can be, teacher attrition, teachers leaving their jobs. And that's just in education as an example, but there's usually some kind of social problem or organizational problem that's going to be driving your study. You want to introduce that. Anchor it with recent statistics or recent citations, right? Don't introduce your problem and have statistics from 10 years ago, because things have likely changed, right? So have So have, recent support for your problem. Okay, get the reader's attention. Look at this look at this challenge, this problem we're having in this area. So that helps get to your topic. Introduce your topic. Also, just introduce the research problem. Again, this is a broad strokes. What is the actual problem in the research to address the social organizational problem, right? There's probably been research done on it. So just kind of mention that, and again, in broad strokes, and then mention that your research is designed to address that, and be specific about why your study is needed. And the introduction shouldn't be too long. Again, this is things you're going to flesh out, or just points you're going to make at the beginning to introduce the reader to what you're doing and why. Maybe a page, maybe a couple pages at the most. But at the end of the introduction, again, things won't be fleshed out, but your reader should have an idea of what you're doing and why you're doing it. Okay, continuing on with that, state what is needed to address the research problem, state what kind of research is needed, and how your study is designed to address that. And again, at the end of this section, your reader should know what you're doing and why. And you can end the section if you want to with a preview of the sections that are going to appear in the chapter. Okay, the background. This is the kind of background information on the topic and specifically, the problem. And it not only includes background on the topic and the problem, but also it includes the background on the research that's been done on the problem. That's real important. So you can't just kind of talk about the social problem or the organizational problem itself. That's part of it. But also what research, where's the research been on the topic and on the problem, right? Because that's going to set up, again, it's kind of broad strokes. It's going to contextualize, it's going to add background, it's going to set up the need for your study. So you want to focus on, trends in the research. Again, you don't have to get really detailed, but trends in the research. What have they been? What have people been focusing on? And that also allows you to see what people have not been focusing on, what is known about the topic, what's not known. And you should end this section where the research stands on your topic, right? And then that kind of funnels into your research problem, or, where the research stands on your topic, where's the gap or where's the problem, what's the need for your study. So it should kind of funnel down to that kind of level of specificity to your own study. The background can, I had to say it can be as long as it needs to be, but usually several pages. To do a kind of a good background to kind of get the reader up. I mean, you have to think about the reader all the time. What does the reader need to know to understand the problem? What do they need to know to understand what the research has been on the topic? What do they need to know to understand what still needs to be done and how your study fits in? Okay, and that should funnel down to the research problem, right? Transitions from the background, and this is a more targeted, you're not broad strokes anymore. You can kind of get specific about your, the specific research problem. What are some of the, what is some of the major and the important research that's been done on what your topic is, your research problem. And that helps to set up what still needs to be done, right? So the research problem represents, it's a problem in the research, just like it sounds, but what does that mean? It means there's an issue or there's something that's unresolved or unknown in the research, right? So the research problem can be a gap that we lack information on something, but that's just one kind of research problem. I think that's the easiest one, and I think people gravitate toward that sometimes. But that's just a type of research problem. Research problem can also be, we have lots of one type of research on a topic. we need other kinds of research, right? So maybe that's where your study comes in. It's going to be, maybe we have lots of qualitative research in an area. We need quantitative research, or vice versa. Or maybe there's specific designs that people have used. We need a new kind of research design. Maybe something has been studied extensively in a certain sector or a certain area, but there's other areas and sectors that type of research is lacking. That's where your study would come in. So that's the kind of idea of a research problem. You know, something that's unresolved or unknown or inconclusive in the research that your study is designed to address. And the gap issue that I mentioned earlier, like the gap can be a specific kind of research problem. Don't just default to it because it's easy, or you think that's what your professor's looking for. If there really is a gap, you should be able to show that or argue that. And there's certain kind of topics that lend themselves to gaps more than others. There's certain kind of things that have been kind of studied a lot, like self-efficacy, leadership, transformational leadership. There's certain topics that have really been covered. Now, they may not have been covered in certain populations, certain samples. But if you say there's a gap somewhere, like there's not a lot of research on something, you should be sure. You should be sure of that. Okay. So the research problem, again, this is kind of condensed. I don't know, schools are different, but you don't need to go on and, for pages for the research problem. It should be pretty targeted. Here's some of the major research in the area. Here's what it shows. Here's what still needs to be done. Specifically state the research problem, specifically state that your study is designed to address that problem. That's the research problem. Now, just one more quick point here about, how do you describe a gap? Just for example, if your research problem is a gap by definition is the absence of something, right? So it's hard to describe something that doesn't exist. So the metaphor that somebody gave me, which I think is really helpful, I'm going to pass it along, is if you think of a donut, right? Besides making you hungry, what if you had to describe the donut hole to somebody? You can't describe the hole because by definition, a hole is the lack of something being there. So what you do is you describe the donut. You frame the gap, right? You frame the absence of whatever it is. And so the donut itself would be the research that already exists on the topic or around the topic, right? As close to it as you can get. So you describe the research that's been done around the topic that is your gap. And that helps to highlight what hasn't been done, which is the gap. I hope that makes sense. Okay. And again, just to kind of tie this back into the topic development thing, if you start with something that you're passionate about, or you start with something that you're really curious about or interested in, if you use that language, it's not going to get past your people. Like, I'm really interested to know, or I think it's really important to know. That language isn't going to fly. Again, it's okay to be really interested in something. It's okay to be drawn to something because of your interests. But you need to go to the research and see if there's really a need for the study. And you need to go to the research if there is a need for your study, to help set it up, right? Researchers, research shows, and researchers say that there needs to be research in this area. So your interest and your passion, whatever it is, need to be corroborated with the research. Okay, the purpose statement is really just kind of a statement of what you're doing in your study. It's basically a nutshell version of your study in a statement. So it's kind of reflects what you're doing. So once you kind of get the research problem down, you start to develop your research questions, and you know what you're doing. Then you can, write your purpose statement, and it usually has a very specific construction, and which I've related here with 2 examples. But let's just go over it real quick. The purpose of this approach design. So let's go with our examples. The purpose of this quantitative correlational approach, quantitative design correlational study, is to, the verb here is not so important. The only thing that's important to notice about the verb is that quantitative studies, usually use words like investigate, examine, measure, assess. Qualitative studies, you can use things like explore, because qualitative studies sometimes are exploratory. We don't have knowledge in an area. We're kind of digging in to see what's going on. Is to examine, investigate, explore, assess, measure, and then whatever your specific variables or concepts are that you're looking at in whatever sample or setting. So let's just take the example. The purpose of this quantitative correlational study is to examine the relationship between transformational leadership and emotional intelligence and the specifics of your sample and setting in a sample of teachers in whatever region or whatever school districts. Same really for the qualitative example. It's just some of the language is a little different. The purpose of this generic qualitative study is to explore, the verb explore instead, the challenges of African-American women as they advance to positions as university presidents in, again, whatever your specific sample and setting is. And that's the purpose statement. And that should really kind of nutshell what you're doing. Now, the purpose section is probably a paragraph, probably not much more than that. And some of the other information in the section might include some specific information about your variables. This is the independent variable, this is the dependent variable, or the major concepts if it's qualitative. You can even mention the instruments you're going to use to measure constructs, if your variables, if it's quantitative. Check your template or your checklist. And while we're here on the purpose, let's talk a little bit about alignment. When your folks, your professors say, make sure your study aligns, they talk about alignment. I mean, the real spine of the study is the proposal is the research question, the purpose, and the research problem. When those things are in alignment, obviously your details, your surrounding details need to align with what you're doing. But those are the big components that when they talk about alignment, you make sure those 3 things align first, and then the kind of details you can work on later. But your research problem drives everything, which needs to align with your research questions. Your research questions should be designed and developed to get the kind of information you need to address the research problem. And what you're doing should be encapsulated, again, in a statement, in the purpose statement, and those things need to align. Sometimes to the degree that you're using, obviously different sentence constructions, but the same kind of language. Right? Like, so your variables should be the same when you talk about your variables, your concepts. This isn't a place where you're looking for variation because your reader might get bored. Well, I used a different term for my variables because I wanted to jazz things up. No, these are your variables that you're studying. They need to stay the same. All right, purpose. RQs typically come next, but again, check your specific template. This is not a methods kind of based webinar, so we're not going to go into depth about how to develop research questions. That is covered in other webinars, so if you're interested in that, check out the methods webinars that we offer. And some of those deal directly with development of research questions. But this would be the place that you state your research questions. And again, they're generally designed to get the information you need to address the research problem. Theoretical framework typically comes next. Again, check your template. A theoretical framework is kind of iffy as far as its location. A lot of schools want it in the chapter 1, and then they want it further developed in the chapter 2. That seems pretty typical. Some schools only want it in the 1. Some schools only want it in the 2. You know, whatever, just follow what your school wants. But the idea here is that this is going to be, you know, the theory or the major the concepts that kind of guide your study and that are going to help explain your results in chapter 5. Now, one of the first questions is theoretical framework or conceptual framework. You've probably seen both the terms. We don't really have to go into a lot of depth on that here. Just suffice it to say for now, and I think for your purposes, that theoretical frameworks are typically associated with quantitative studies. Conceptual frameworks are typically associated with qualitative studies. Usually, let's say for a quantitative study, for example, which would have a theoretical framework. For a quantitative study, you're going to usually be measuring something, right, with a tool or an instrument or a survey. Those instruments have theoretical foundations. They all do, because you can't develop an instrument from nothing, right? They come from theories. They have a theoretical foundation. So you want to use the theory that's associated with your instruments, right? Again, I'm going back to my old example of transformational leadership and emotional intelligence. Let's just take emotional intelligence. So there's several instruments to measure emotional intelligence. You're going to choose an instrument that's more suited to the information that you want to get. Let's say you choose Goleman's instrument. Okay, well, Goleman has, you know, his theoretical foundations. You want to use Goleman's theory of emotional intelligence as your theoretical framework then, because you're using Goleman's instrument. You don't want to use Goleman's instrument and use Jones's theory of emotional intelligence, because it may be a little different. Now, the general theories are probably going to be similar, but they may have different components. If they have different components, they may have different, you know, sections for that on the questionnaire. So just make sure that whatever instrument you're using to measure whatever, you use the same theory, the same person's theory who developed the instrument. For conceptual frameworks, for qualitative studies, sometimes there's not a theory that encapsulates what you want to do. So you kind of have to take some of the major concepts that you're studying and use those, kind of put those together as a framework. But basically what you want to do is define the theory. You know, use the theorist, again, who's most closely associated with the development of your instrument. Define the theory, anchor it with a source, you know, including the year, obviously, who developed the theory. And theories are developed to explain things. That's what theories do. They explain things. Who developed the theory? What did they develop it for? What did they develop it to explain? What a little bit about what researchers have used the theory for, and most importantly, how the theory connects to your study, or will help, you know, guide your study and explain your results. Okay, again, this is kind of general information about the theoretical framework. And again, just a point here while I'm thinking about it. You know, it's great that you attend webinars. Use your resources on the internet, the library, your professors. But sometimes there's just no substitute for getting an example of an approved dissertation from your school in your area. Maybe, you know, in a similar kind of study that you've done, just to see how people have handled these sections. I guess sometimes there's just no substitute for just like a concrete example. Okay, nature of the study or study design usually comes next. This is methods. Again, so I'm not going to get too in depth on it. Again, we do offer methods webinars, so you can attend one of those if you're more interested in this. But basically, it lays out the rationale for the selection of your design. Summarize the methodology, including your sample, how your data is going to be collected, how your data is going to be analyzed. Okay. All right, let's see. Are we at definitions? Okay, yeah, definitions. There should be a section on defining the terms for your study, right? And so this would include definitely definitions of any factors or variables that you're studying, any major concepts, if it's qualitative. Definition should be in the form of sentences. Check your template. Sometimes it doesn't specify, but I always default to putting definitions in the form of sentences. That way, nobody can come back and say, this is a fragment, or, put it into a sentence. Definition should be clear and succinct. Okay, this is, sometimes people start getting into discussions in their definitions. Definitions are not discussions, right? They are to define the terms and the factors and the concepts that you're using in your study and how you're using them in your study specifically. So usually there are two sentences maybe at the most. They're clear, they're succinct. Follow the formula like emotional intelligence will refer to, or emotional intelligence is defined as. They should be anchored with peer-reviewed sources. Absolutely, under no circumstances should you use dictionary definitions. Those are general layman's definitions. The definitions should come from the literature, and they should be specific to how you are using these terms in your study. Sources should be recent when possible. That's less important here with the definitions, because sometimes you're using a theorist maybe for the definitions, and sometimes theories lag behind everything else because they take so long to develop. Recent sources when possible, but not absolutely necessary, but definitely peer-reviewed sources. Okay, how many, how long? We talked about the length of each entry. But you don't need, I've seen people put methods terms in here. You don't need methods terms. Okay, you don't need that because you're going to cover all the methods stuff in your methods chapter. All right, significance. Sometimes this section is called implications, and this is what the professors like to call the so what section. So you're studying this, so what? Who cares? And they're just being a little glib, but the idea is to talk a little bit about why your findings are significant and to whom, right? Or the implications that may follow from your findings. And usually there's two prongs to this. There are practical implications and there are research implications. So for practical implications, it's just like it sounds. How might folks at the level of practice in whatever area it is you're studying on whatever topic, how could your findings inform what they do? And again, this is forward-looking. In chapter 5, when you actually get your results, you're going to talk about practical implications based on what you actually found. Right now, this is forward-looking, like how your findings might inform and who they might inform at the level of practice. So if you're doing some kind of education study, the people who could benefit from your findings might be teachers, right? They might be administrators. They could be students themselves. They could be parents. It just depends on what you're studying. And the other prong to this is how might your findings inform research How might they be important to research? You know, what might your findings add to the research in the area? You know, they're designed to address a gap or a certain kind of problem. You know, what will that add to our understanding of the issue or the problem? Again, you won't know for sure, but this is kind of, again, forward-looking, which we'll discuss more in chapter 5 when you actually have your findings. Other sections, I've kind of lumped these together because some schools have them, some schools don't. But usually you need to mention a little bit about your limitations. Again, forward-looking. You're not sure what the limitations are. You're kind of forecasting like what might be potential limitations. And limitations are any weaknesses or shortcomings that may affect your results, right? So sometimes, you know, if you're dealing with a vulnerable population, sometimes there can be issues getting access to that sample, of that population. You may have to use a proxy group. Qualitative studies, you know, bias is sometimes researcher bias if you're too close to a topic. And if you mention something like, you know, researcher bias, you should explain a little bit how you plan to mitigate that. And there are ways to mitigate researcher bias. You know, look at that if that pertains to you. You know, sometimes you can kind of set aside or bracket your preconceived notions, or make notes and, you know, write down things that you already know. So it kind of, it gets it on paper. You know, your preconceived notions, so you can kind of set them to the side. For quantitative studies, you know, big limitations are things like a low sample size. And sometimes that's hard to forecast, like you're not sure. But if you think there might be, you know, difficulty in getting, you know, a full sample size or what's needed to sufficiently power your study, you know, you might mention that. We're still dealing with COVID to some degree. That can throw wrinkles into your research. So anything that might pose a problem down the road as you conduct your study. Assumptions, this is a good thing to look up in the research and get a good solid definition of it, make sure you understand it. But generally, they're kind of things that you have to take for granted, that you have to assume because you have no control over them. So for example, one big assumption for all studies is that your participants are going to answer honestly and to the best of their ability. I mean, you will tell them that, you know, of course, their information will be confidential. It will be anonymous. So there's nothing to worry about there. But still, you don't have any say-so or control over what they're going to say. So you just have to assume they're going to answer honestly and straightforwardly. And sometimes there's a section called scope. Sometimes it's called scope and delimitations, or just one or the other. They're really kind of the same thing. And really it's the boundaries of your study. And it sounds a lot like, you know, your purpose, and it may re-mention the, you know, your sample, your setting, what you're including in your study, right? And maybe if you're doing an education study and you're just studying a particular segment, you know, just teachers, right? Sometimes it's helpful to say I'm just studying teachers, not students, not counselors, you know, not tutors. You know, if there's some, I don't know, maybe potential confusion about, you know, where you're, you know, who you're studying, where your boundaries begin and end. Sometimes it's helpful just to reinforce those boundaries. I think of it as, I don't know if you remember these old movies or cartoons where you see somebody looking through a scope or a telescope or something, and you see the little round image on the screen and the corners of the screen are blacked out. That's kind of like this, you know, what's in the scope, right? What's in the round part is what's in your study. The other stuff is outside. And again, that's a helpful one to look at samples, and that section is typically not very long. All these sections are typically not very long. Just make sure you kind of touch on what your template is asking for. Okay, and then we're at the summary. And again, double check your templates. Some schools don't require a summary at the end of chapter 1. Some schools do. If your school doesn't, fine, you can end. If your school does, you know, summaries are pretty standard. Just recap the major points of the chapter. Remind the reader of the research problem and why your study is needed. And if you want, you can end by transitioning to the next chapter or something like, you know, the next chapter will be chapter 2, which is the lit review, something like that. This is our information, who we are. Here's our contact information. Yet we are a dissertation consulting company. We provide, you know, editing, statistics assistance, consulting guidance, you know, help addressing comments from professors. We offer free consultations. So if that's something you're interested in asking more about, just, you know, reach out to one of these through one of these methods. Okay, and I will, I see that we already have some questions now, so let's just kind of open it up generally to questions, and I'll try to answer the ones that have already been asked. Okay. Hi, Tom. I was wondering about the best methodological approach to acculturation-based research that can assist me in actually getting my research published. I would need more to go on than that to answer that definitively. And I'm not a methods person. I do all the other stuff, the theories and you know, research. So I'm not the best person to ask for methodological questions. I guess I would need a little more information to try to answer it. Acculturation-based research, I'm not sure. If there are, I mean, I can say this, or if there are things, factors, constructs you want to measure, or something you want to assess or measure, you know, quantitative. If it's exploratory and it's more about ideas and getting it, you know, people's insights and, you know, their experiences, that would be qualitative. And as far as the actual design, again, there's not enough information to go on for that. But if you do have methodological questions specifically, I encourage you to attend one of our methodological webinars. Okay, next question. Do the definitions need in-text and reference page citations? They just need a citation at the end. Like you have a sentence, you have the definition, and then you just put the citation at the end where you got the, you know, the information. You don't need, they don't need to be quotes. I mean, they can be, but professors typically don't like you to quote very much. They prefer paraphrasing. So I think just really just an, you know, in text citation at the end, you know, Jones, comma 2020. It's fine for the definitions. Any other questions? Are those the only two questions? No more? I'll give folks a couple minutes if they're typing. Okay, well, if there are no more questions, I will wish you all, here's one, okay. What is the typical length of an entire intro? Typical length, 10 to 20 pages. You know, give or take, but you know, really about realistically 12 to 15. So they're not really, you know, they're not long, but you need to kind of, you know, be concise, you know, focused, and just, you know, ask, you know, cover what they're asking for on whatever template or guidelines they give you. If your school doesn't have template or guidelines, then see if your chair can provide you with guidelines. See if your chair can provide you with maybe an example they want you to follow. But yeah, to answer your question, I'd say 12 to 15 pages. give or take. I mean, if you're going on more than 20, that's a problem, because that means you don't have focus. I mean, or you're adding stuff from other, stuff that should be in other chapters to the chapter 1. Okay, great. Any more questions? All right, you're welcome. Thank you for the kind words. All right, I'll let everybody go. Enjoy the rest of your day. Contact us if you just want some more information. And remember, use your resources, webinars, the internet, your library, reference library assistant, a big help. So be sure to use all your resources at your disposal. All right, thank you everybody for coming. Have a great day. Oh, you're welcome. Thank you.